Professor Jason Baer is a professor in the philosophy department at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he's been teaching since 2003. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Washington in Seattle in 2002 under the supervision of Lawrence Bonjour, and his first book on virtue epistemology, The Inquiring Mind on Intellectual Virtues and Virtue Epistemology, was published in 2011 by Oxford University Press. From 2012 to 2015, Jason directed the Intellectual Virtues in Education Project, which was funded by a grant of over $1 million by the John Templeton Foundation and involved the application of virtue epistemology to educational theory and practice. In connection with that project, Jason helped found the Intellectual Virtues Academy of Long Beach, a charter middle school in Long Beach, California, and edited Intellectual Virtues in Education, Essays in Applied Virtue Epistemology, published by Routledge in 2016. More recently, Jason Baer has written a book for teachers titled Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues, published by Harvard Education Press in 2021. And today he will be speaking to us about keeping an open mind, the nature and value of open-mindedness. I will be monitoring the chat, so if you have questions as they come up, please post them there. And without further ado, here's Jason Baer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. Well, I want to say thank you to Dr. Ilham for the invitation to be with you today, and thanks as well to everybody who's played a role in helping organize and advertise the event. And thanks to those of you who are tuning in, probably from many different places. Thank you for taking the time to listen and think with me about open-mindedness. I will go ahead and jump right in. The three main things I'd like to do today are first to sketch for you an account of what open-mindedness is. It's defining features and character. Second, to explain how open-mindedness is related to other intellectual virtues, both virtues that are similar to open-mindedness and virtues that are different from and can kind of pull in a different direction. Third, I'd like to consider with you whether open-mindedness is compatible with firm conviction. Can we be convinced about something and also be open-minded about it? So those are the three main themes or topics or questions that I plan to discuss with you. Let me first go ahead and just mention a couple of caveats related to what I'll be saying. First is that I approach this topic, and we'll be doing so in the course of this talk, as a virtue epistemologist. Virtue epistemology is an approach to the philosophical study of knowledge and related states that foregrounds or emphasizes the importance of intellectual virtues, open-mindedness being a paradigm case of an intellectual virtue. But the upshot of this is that as I'll be talking about open-mindedness at a philosophical, largely conceptual level. So I won't be talking a lot about empirical data or experimental data related to open-mindedness, but will be again operating at a higher, somewhat more abstract level. And I hope that that's not too disorienting or off-putting. I don't know how many of you are coming to this from a distinctively philosophical background, but that'll be my approach, and I just wanted to flag that at the outset. Secondly, I'll be talking about open-mindedness in a particular context, namely the context of doxastic conflict or disagreement. I think that open-mindedness has a broader application than that. I think a person can be impartial and undecided and still exercise open-mindedness. So where there's not necessarily disagreement, I think open-mindedness can still be brought to bear. I also think that open-mindedness can be brought to bear on creative endeavors where, again, conflict or disagreement needn't really be present. But for our purposes today, I'm going to limit my attention to thinking about open-mindedness in the context of disagreement. Okay, I'll begin with an illustration or an example of open-mindedness as I'm thinking about it. And this example concerns the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And notoriously, their relationship was complicated. Specifically, Stanton didn't have, at least not in all throughout the total course of Lincoln's presidency, didn't have a whole lot of respect for Lincoln. And he was not reluctant to share that and to show that to Lincoln and to others. So he had a tendency to sort of undermine Lincoln. And in a book called Virtuous Minds, the author Philip Dow discusses an instance, an occasion of conflict between Lincoln and his Secretary of War, Stanton. And this is how Dow describes what happens. He says, at one of the war's most critical points, Lincoln sent a direct order to Stanton. Not only did Stanton refuse to carry it out, but he again publicly mocked Lincoln, calling him a fool. Instead of reacting out of anger or spite, Lincoln is said to have replied, if Stanton said I'm a fool, then I must be, for he's nearly always right. I'll see for myself. Lincoln was no wimp. He had demonstrated many times over that he was more than willing to buck the opinions of others if he believed they were wrong. Still, as the story goes, the two men had a meeting in which Lincoln listened carefully to his subordinate, concluded that Stanton was right, and withdrew his order. There's a lot that could be said about this passage and this conversation, but I want to draw attention to three kind of movements that we see on Lincoln's part. First, Lincoln was willing to consider an opposing viewpoint. Second, he was willing to give that viewpoint a fair and honest hearing. And third, when he found the opposing viewpoint more plausible than his own, he changed his mind. I think those three movements on Lincoln's part capture nicely some of the fundamental or defining features of open-mindedness. Here then is a kind of concise characterization or definition of open-mindedness, at least as it pertains to contexts of disagreement. And in case, this is how I'll be thinking about open-mindedness in the rest of the talk. Open-mindedness is an intelligent disposition to take up opposing viewpoints, to give them honest and fair consideration, and to change one's mind if one finds that, on the whole, the opposing viewpoint is better supported by the available evidence. So open-mindedness is an intelligent disposition to take up opposing viewpoints, to give them honest and fair consideration, and to change one's mind if one finds that, on the whole, the opposing viewpoint is better supported by the available evidence. So let me comment a little bit about a few parts of this definition. First of all, open-mindedness, as I'm thinking about it, is an intelligent disposition. It's not indiscriminate. So the open-minded person does not always and everywhere and without any consideration for rationality or truth give a consideration to opposing viewpoints. You could see how that might sort of send us off the rails cognitively if, with respect to every single idea that we were presented with, we were to stop and take the time and give it a fair and honest hearing. No, it's an intelligent or discriminating disposition to do that. And I'll have a little bit more to say later on about what that might look like in practice. But I just want you to see that I'm thinking about it in somewhat narrower terms than might be obvious from an initial characterization of it. Second of all, it's important that if we are to be open-minded, that not just that we are willing to listen to an opposing viewpoint or to read about it, the quality of the consideration that we give to the opposing viewpoint matters as well. So if I regularly stop and listen to people that disagree with me, but the entire time I'm listening, I'm simply critical and dismissive about what they're saying, then I'm not really open-minded. Finally, suppose that I habitually listen to people who disagree with me and give an honest and fair consideration to what they have to say, but then just immediately, without further thought, return to my original belief and am on my way. There again, it seems that I'd be lacking in open-mindedness. Open-mindedness makes a claim not only on our willingness to consider alternative viewpoints, and not only on the quality of the consideration that we show for alternative viewpoints, but also it makes a claim on how we respond to the outcome of our honest and fair consideration of opposing viewpoints. And there the suggestion is that if such consideration leads one to judge that on balance the evidence favors the opposing viewpoint, if we're going to be open-minded, we've got to be willing to adjust or revise our beliefs accordingly. And that's a significant demand, and it's also something that I'll return to later on in the talk. So I'll now say a little bit more about how I'm conceptualizing open-mindedness. And you could think of open-mindedness merely as an attitude that can kind of come and go depending on the situation. It could be fairly fleeting. Or you could think of it primarily as simply a skill that one might have, the skill of perspective switching, maybe. But again, I'm coming at this topic from the standpoint of virtue epistemology, at least a large part of which considers intellectual virtues to be attributes or virtues of intellectual character. And so again, this is how I'm thinking of open-mindedness. You don't have to think about it in this way, but I do want to flesh out in a little bit more detail what it would mean to think of open-mindedness as an attribute of intellectual character. By character here, I simply mean the nexus of dispositions that each of us possesses to act, think, and feel in particular ways and in particular contexts. And by intellectual character, I mean one's character as a thinker or a learner. So typically when we think about character, what comes to mind are attributes or virtues like kindness or compassion, or maybe civic virtues like tolerance or respect. And those are virtues of moral character or virtues of civic character. And while those are important, and while those dimensions of character cover a lot of ground, they don't exhaust the terrain of personal character. Our character as persons also expresses itself in our lives as thinkers and learners. Our character expresses itself in whether we ask questions, what we ask questions about, why we ask questions. It expresses itself in our attitudes toward epistemic states or ends like truth, or knowledge, or understanding, or evidence. If I don't care about those things, if I recklessly disregard any concern with truth or evidence, that says something about my character. So intellectual character then is sort of the nexus of dispositions that a person possesses to act, think, and feel in various ways in their role or in their lives as thinkers and learners. So I'm thinking of open-mindedness naturally then as an attribute of character that expresses itself in how we think and learn. Might also be helpful to point out that intellectual virtues, as I'm thinking of them and as many virtue epistemologists think of them, have a kind of common motivational basis. They are qualities that are rooted in, or you might say kind of flow from, a concern with, a desire for, some would say a love of epistemic goods, again, such as knowledge, truth, evidence, understanding, maybe even wisdom. As one virtue epistemologist puts it, intellectual virtues are the qualities that a truth-desiring person would want to have. If I care about knowledge or care about truth, then I will be motivated to ask good questions, admit my intellectual limitations, take up alternative points of view, and give them a fair and honest hearing. So again, intellectual virtues have a common motivational basis, which I'm describing here as a concern with epistemic goods. Another way to characterize intellectual virtues that I think is helpful and illuminating is as occupying a mean or midpoint between two extremes. Now, I'm sure many of you who are listening are familiar with Aristotle's famous doctrine of the mean, according to which for any given moral or ethical virtue, there are certain actions and feelings such that to possess the virtue, one must instantiate or perform those actions, experience those feelings at the right time, in the right way, in the right amount, toward the right person, and so on. For any given virtue, take, for instance, courage, you can go too far with it. It can become excessive, and it becomes a vice, in this case, the vice of recklessness. But of course, with the actions and feelings characteristic of courage, we can also go not far enough. And if we do, that locates us in the position of cowardice, which would be the vice of deficiency that corresponds to the virtue of courage, according to Aristotle. So I think the same basic point applies to intellectual virtues, including to open-mindedness. And so if open-mindedness is about taking up alternative points of view and giving them a certain kind of consideration and so on, clearly we can go not far enough with that. We can be deficient in our dispositions when it comes to that kind of activity. And if we do, we're likely to be closed-minded. But we can also go too far in our consideration of opposing viewpoints. There's the famous saying, don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. That's sort of getting at an excessive version of open-mindedness that we might describe instead as a kind of gullibility or a kind of intellectual wishy-washiness. One pair of co-authors describes that state as a kind of intellectual flaccidity. But again, the idea is open-mindedness, as we're thinking about it, an attribute of intellectual character, says something important about who we are as persons, rooted in something like a concern for epistemic goods and occupying a midpoint or mean between closed-mindedness on the one hand and gullibility or flaccidity on the other. Okay, so that's my initial kind of overview of open-mindedness understood as a virtue of intellectual character. I want to turn now to think with you a little bit about how open-mindedness is related to other intellectual virtues. And part of what motivates this part of my talk is what I would describe as a kitchen sink worry. Intellectual character is a relatively new construct. Philosophers and others have been talking about intellectual virtues for centuries, millennia, but they haven't typically thought of intellectual virtues as attributes of character. The philosophers and psychologists and others who have thought about character have tended to focus on moral virtues and civic virtues. But the idea of intellectual character suggests that no, character is broader, that it intersects as well, it intersects not just with our lives as neighbors or citizens, but as thinkers and learners and inquirers and truth seekers. But this is a relatively new idea. And so there's a tendency on the part of theorists, if they find themselves interested in a particular intellectual virtue, such as curiosity, or this has happened in some of the earlier literature in intellectual humility, and it's happened in the open-mindedness literature, there can be a tendency to try to pack everything but the kitchen sink into this construct of humility or open-mindedness or curiosity. And I think that's problematic. I think it obscures interesting differences and connections between what are fundamentally distinct or at some level separable intellectual virtues. So kind of to help us resist that sort of error, I want to think with you a little bit about how we might individuate intellectual virtues. And by that, I mean how we might distinguish one virtue like open-mindedness from another, like intellectual courage or autonomy or humility. And here's a general principle for doing that. We can say that for every intellectual virtue V, you can plug whatever you want into V there, there is an activity, skill, or competence characteristic of V on the basis of which V can be distinguished from other intellectual virtues. So if we're wanting to understand how is humility related to open-mindedness or curiosity, we should ask, well, what is the activity, skill, or competence characteristic of each? And my suggestion is we might get something like the following breakdown. We can think of curiosity, take it that this is pretty intuitive. It also fits well with the research in virtue epistemology, but curiosity is about the skill or competence of asking thoughtful questions, wondering. Intellectual courage is concerned with the skill or skills associated with taking intellectual risks. Intellectual humility is about the activity of attending to and being willing to own, rather than resist or deny, our intellectual limitations and mistakes. And then open-mindedness, as we're thinking about it, is about the activity or skill of taking up opposing viewpoints, or to put it more succinctly, perspective switching. So we can distinguish individual virtues on the basis of their characteristic activities or skills or competencies. Okay. In that case, then, it might be worthwhile exploring the relationship, or looking a little bit more closely at the relationship between intellectual humility and what I'm describing here as certain supporting virtues. And these are virtues that are closely related to open-mindedness, that sometimes get sort of confused with open-mindedness. Let's start with open-mindedness and the connection between open-mindedness and intellectual humility. Again, I want to say these aren't the same thing. Open-mindedness is fundamentally about perspective switching. Intellectual humility is fundamentally about being aware of and owning our intellectual limitations. While not the same thing, we should also expect these two things to be closely correlated, right? And connected in interesting ways. So think about this with me. It's not hard to imagine how open-mindedness might facilitate intellectual humility. In fact, we saw that with the Abe Lincoln example. Lincoln was open to hearing Stanton's viewpoint. And when he discovered in that process that Stanton's viewpoint was more accurate than his, that gave him an opportunity to say, oh, I'm wrong, you're right, and so let me change my belief. So his open-mindedness led to an application of his intellectual humility. And in fact, you might have noticed that open-mindedness sort of encompasses an element of intellectual humility, in the sense that it requires changing your mind under certain conditions. And to change your mind is to admit you were wrong. So open-mindedness can both sort of facilitate, as it does for Lincoln, and also demand or incorporate an application or exercise of intellectual humility. But it can also go the other way around. intellectual humility can also facilitate open-mindedness. So if I think, if I have a deficiency of intellectual humility and think all my beliefs are right, I'm infallible, or something leaning in that direction, I'm rarely, if ever, wrong, I'm smarter than most other people, and so on, then what reason or motivation will I have to consider opposing viewpoints? They will stand only to mislead me or to pull me away from the truth. And so conversely, if I have a lively and accurate sense of the limitations of my knowledge and the limitations of my cognitive abilities and of my evidence base, that will it proportionally open up the possibility that it might be worthwhile for me to listen to other people, because I know my views aren't perfect. I know my beliefs are not infallible. And so I might do well to consider alternative standpoints. So in that respect, intellectual humility can facilitate open-mindedness. Another virtue closely related to open-mindedness is curiosity. We think of open-mindedness and curiosity as at least kind of going hand in hand, and that makes sense. Open-mindedness, for instance, can facilitate curiosity. Here again, we can start by thinking about what a closed-minded person might be like. Closed-minded people aren't typically curious, right? Because they aren't interested in thinking about things in a different way. And so their beliefs are fixed, and there's sort of nothing new to reconsider, no real questions to ask. So closed-mindedness would sort of disincentivize curiosity, whereas open-mindedness acquaints us with new and different ways of thinking, which leads or can lead naturally to the asking of questions. Maybe something's unclear about this other way of thinking, or maybe there's something insightful about this other way of thinking that generates other interesting questions. So open-mindedness, again, can facilitate curiosity. And then you can see where I'm going with the next point. Curiosity can also facilitate open-mindedness. There's a sense in which curiosity sort of takes us away from what is immediately present or actual, and can take us to what's possible, or to what was, or to what might someday be, right? It sort of informs our imagination. But in doing so, then it precipitates or can facilitate the consideration of very different ways of thinking about the world. So curiosity can naturally facilitate applications or expressions of open-mindedness. Oh dear, I'm just seeing that my computer is threatening to go to sleep on me in just a minute. So let me, and I usually have a power cord right here. So we're just going to take a 30-second break. I'm going to run out of the room and I'm going to grab my power cord from the other room. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. This might be a good opportunity if questions are coming up for anyone in the audience. I know I'm not alone in thinking this is a really thought-provoking lecture. So if questions do come up, please put them in the chat so that when we have time at the end, we can pass them along.
Okay. How are we doing on time? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. So we've looked a little bit at how open-mindedness might be related to very similar virtues like intellectual humility and curiosity. But I think it's also worth thinking about how open-mindedness might be related to virtues that kind of pull us in a different direction. I refer to these as competing virtues, but I have quotes around that because I don't think, strictly speaking, they're competing, but they do sort of pull in a different direction. So to introduce this idea of competing virtues, we might think of open-mindedness as a kind of liberal virtue, though again, quotes around liberal, because by that I just mean that can lead to kind of a free exercise of the mind. Curiosity would be a liberal virtue in this sense, sort of more in the sense of liberal arts. Sort of, they move us forward in the intellectual life, or can move us forward in the intellectual life by helping us understand and ask questions and think of new ways of thinking and so on. But someone whose mind is just characterized by open-mindedness and curiosity, say, might be led astray, or at least have a kind of incomplete cognitive framework or psychology. And that's because these, what I'm referring to as liberal virtues, also need to be constrained, or I think it's more of a complementary relationship, but they need to be constrained by what I would refer to as conservative virtues, again with scare quotes, things like carefulness or caution, or even perseverance in a particular belief. And to see the importance of these other virtues, I mean, we need only note that we're often susceptible to what people around us believe, right? And sometimes we have reason to think that the people around us might not be the most knowledgeable about a particular subject matter. And so there might be occasions where instead of going all in with open-mindedness, we might exercise a certain kind of caution, because we know of ourselves that if we go too far with open-mindedness, we might end up getting misled or falling prey to a kind of intellectual conformity. So another way to think about this is that when it comes to the intellectual life, we want truth, but we also want to avoid error, right? If all we cared about was just truth, then at least theoretically, it would make sense to believe everything, whether true or false, because then you wouldn't miss any truths. But that wouldn't be very desirable. We want to believe what's true and to avoid believing what's false. And virtues like open-mindedness and curiosity, they favor the goal of truth. But then we also need virtues like carefulness and caution and a willingness to hold on, to have the courage of our convictions under the right in the right context. We also need that to prevent ourselves from falling into cognitive error. Okay, well then an obvious question here is how then do we adjudicate between open-mindedness and its competing virtues? When should I sort of pull the tap of carefulness or caution rather than the tap of open-mindedness or curiosity or something like that? And that's a very difficult question. There is no simple principle or sort of decision procedure that we can apply to get us the right answer to that question. It's highly contextual, situationally dependent, to some extent dependent on the person and what their abilities and evidence are and so on. But I will say to kind of get at a decent rule of thumb, we can remind ourselves that the fundamental motivational concern of intellectual virtues is trying to acquire knowledge or truth and avoid error. So we should let those values govern our judgment about which virtue is relevant to which situation. And if we do, we at least get the following somewhat helpful rule of thumb, which is that we should exercise the virtue that we have reason to believe is most likely in the situation in which we find ourselves, to increase rather than diminish our share in epistemic goods and our avoidance, we could say, of epistemic bads or evils or cognitive error. So in other words, the idea is that in some situations, like if I know that I'm not very good at, don't know a lot about a particular topic, or and don't really have the skills necessary for thinking through that topic, well then I probably want to favor open-mindedness and intellectual humility and curiosity. But there may be other situations where those roles are sort of reversed, and in that case, well, I might have reason to think that carefulness and caution and not a lot of open-mindedness or intellectual humility would stand the best chance of helping me get closer to the truth and avoid cognitive error. So I think that when we think about the goal or telos of these virtues, we have to let those considerations sort of inform and bear which virtue we decide to practice in a given situation. Okay. Quickly, then I want to say something about the distinctive value of open-mindedness. Like why is this a virtue? Why is it valuable? Why does it for many of us resonate as an important quality today? And here we can just look at certain facts about our own cognition and about our own cognitive or epistemic environments. So one such fact has to do with just the research that we've seen in the last decade or more, and it's been around for longer than that, but it's sort of come into popular consciousness in a way, of our various hardwired biases. Things like confirmation bias, in-group bias, overconfidence bias, all of which point to the tendency on our part to think too narrowly, and hence the need to, again, at the right time, in the right situation and so on, be more open-minded. Similarly, we see on display in much of the world today certain defective habits of mind or intellectual vices, such as closed-mindedness, narrow-mindedness, dogmatism, to the extent that we have internalized those qualities and they've become habits of mind. Open-mindedness and other virtues present themselves as kind of natural and important antidotes to some of those habits. And then further, there is the very ironic phenomenon of kind of epistemic isolation and epistemic insulation that we confront today. On the one hand, we have access to far more information and knowledge than we ever have, and yet there are certain features of how that information is structured and delivered that can result in our being epistemically insulated, and therefore ultimately having kind of less access to truth and knowledge and so on. So you think of things here like social media algorithms and so-called filter bubbles and echo chambers. Again, open-mindedness helps push against some of that insulation and isolation. It is not, of course, the only or even the primary solution to some of these problems. But insofar as we as epistemic agents need to play a role in sort of handling our biases and defective habits of mind and epistemic insulation, so far as that the solution to that is partly personal, it does seem that open-mindedness is going to have an important role to play in that. I'm going to skip this quote from John Stuart Mill. It's kind of a famous quote, but it's a wonderful description of the importance of open-mindedness in public discourse. The last thing I'm going to say, and I'm not going to say as much about it as I hoped I'd have time for, but just want to take up the question briefly of whether open-mindedness is compatible with firm conviction. Because it can be tempting to think that it's not. It can be tempting to think that if I'm really convinced of something, why would it ever make sense for me to be open-minded about it? And there's a problem with that way of thinking. And I've tried to succinctly summarize it in this way. Having a firm and well-supported belief need not, and in many cases should not, prevent us from being open to the possibility that this belief might be mistaken, maybe in part, maybe in whole. So I can be very convinced of something, but still recognize that I could be wrong, either in part or in whole. And to the extent that I might be wrong, it can make perfectly good sense for me to consider, honestly and fairly, evidence or arguments against this belief. In other words, it still leaves room for an application of open-mindedness. Open-mindedness, it can make sense to be open-minded about a particular belief of mine, provided that my evidence for that belief is not utterly and completely conclusive. The possibility of error can lead to the rationality of considering counter evidence or alternative points of view. So in that respect, firm conviction is quite compatible with open-mindedness. Now, it's not, I mean, it is sort of that simple in a way, but I do feel like I need to remind us that if I'm next to certain but not totally certain that something is true, and I therefore give an open-minded hearing to an alternative perspective, and then realize, oh, I was mistaken, it does require revising my belief. And a further point that I'd hoped to talk about that sort of now becomes salient for many of us, I think, is, well, maybe there are certain types of beliefs that I am highly confident in that I'm not really willing to revise. And I'm thinking in particular of something like religious beliefs or religious faith. So, I mean, maybe this is what I should have started with, but I've run out of time, and we can talk about this if we need to in the Q&A. But I think it's an interesting question, whether open-mindedness might be compatible with religious faith. And of course, that's going to could depend on which faith we're talking about and so on. But I think I'll leave it at that for now, because we're at or a little bit over time. And again, if we want to talk more about this or religious faith and open-mindedness, that's something we can do in the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So one, I think that is a really interesting position to maybe engage with in the Q&A, but kind of summarizing several of the questions that have come in, people seem very interested, myself included, about if we adopt this approach to open-mindedness, how flexible or malleable do we think it is in terms of for ourselves, like how can one cultivate their own open-mindedness? And then also for others, if you think about it interpersonally, either as, you know, a parent or a teacher with young people, or as from one adult to another, if you have someone who particularly feels closed-minded in your own life, how you can encourage them to work on their open-mindedness. So one internal and the other external, maybe they're the same principles applied, but those are the kind of the questions that people are struggling with, I think.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Okay. Well, I'd like to be able to say I'm a philosopher, not a psychologist, so I don't need to answer that question. But I'm also quite invested in the enterprise of educating for virtues like open-mindedness. And so to the question, is open-mindedness, as I'm describing about it, something that can be nurtured in ourselves and others? I will say that my one sentence answer to that question is, well, no, I can't give a one sentence answer. I'll just say, let's remember that open-mindedness isn't a binary property. It's not something that you either have or don't have. It's something that can be possessed in degrees. And so the question should be, can we nurture some kind of meaningful growth in ourselves or others along these lines? And there, I think we do have reasons to be optimistic, but I also think that that process is complicated. It's not instantaneous, and it's highly complex. And so let me just, if I could, speak about this in an educational context. So I think that just to try to not, I really could talk a long time about this, but I'll just try to be concise and say, I think that in an educational context, I'm not optimistic about me being able to make my relative who sees the world very differently than I do become more open-minded, especially not in any quick way. I mean, my 2 cents about that would be, what is my relational connection to that person? And how can I build trust with that person? And how can I show empathy and understanding to that person? Which would be sort of a backdoor way to helping them become a little bit more open-minded. But that's just sort of like, if we're talking about interpersonally, I think it has to be indirect. I think it's very difficult to do, but it doesn't come by telling people to be open-minded or by giving them alternative perspectives in their inbox or text thread or whatever. I think it comes through establishing a caring and trusting relationship with them, such that they might eventually be open to seeing things differently. In an educational context, though, where we have more access to persons over time, and have a certain kind of position of influence that we might not with our in-laws or something like that, I think there are lots of different things we can do, which taken together can have at least a modest impact on the thinking of our students, on the thinking of a significant number of our students. And so that would be things like, one, helping them see what open-mindedness is and helping them see it as an attractive sort of thing to aim at. That's one. Also then, giving them opportunities to think about themselves and where their own character is in terms of open-mindedness and closed-mindedness. So there may be opportunities for self-reflection that can play into their own formation of open-mindedness. Certainly, I think creating well-supported opportunities for students to engage in perspective switching. And by well-supported, I mean, among other things, creating opportunities where they can safely explore and consider alternative points of view. And then providing feedback on their development of the competence of switching perspective. So sort of helping them see this as a goal, helping them understand where they're at in relation to that goal, creating opportunities for them to practice open-mindedness. And I could talk at length about what that might look like, but it's not hard to do. A lot of us already do it who teach, but I think we can get better at it and more explicit about it. And then the last thing I'll say, of course, is modeling. The modeling of open-mindedness for our students is, in my opinion, just about as powerful as anything. And frankly, that probably applies interpersonally from one single adult to another, or from me to my in-laws, or something like that, the modeling of it myself. So again, I think it can be the question, like, it can be discouraging to think this is kind of an ideal, what I've described, and then it's sort of think, yeah, but is this realistic? Well, again, the question is what realistic? Radical and total transformation of everybody in my class or in all of my family? No, that's not realistic at all. But can I help a significant number of my students make some meaningful progress toward that ideal? There, I think the answer is yes. I don't think it's easy. I don't think there's a simple single way to do it, but I think it's possible. And I do have, you mentioned it, and I do have a recent book titled Deep in Thought, a Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues, that talks a lot about open-mindedness and ways that we can facilitate that. So if you are interested in learning more, that would be one thing you could look at.
Wonderful, thank you. reason for optimism and also for realism there, which is
Yeah.
sounds about right. This might be the last question just because of time and how you might be able to engage with it. But a question in the chat that kind of speaks to the thought that you finished your presentation on is, I'll just read it out. Isn't it possible to have full conviction and be open-minded as well, recognizing a spectrum of views within a larger framework, such as various ways of practicing within a faith?
I think so. Maybe, but I think so, but it depends. So if we're imagining a scenario where my evidence for a given belief is as certain as it could be, and where my conviction is as strong as it could be, and if we're also imagining, and this is the person who asked the question probably wasn't imagining this further detail, if we're also imagining that that conviction logically rules out the truth of various other viewpoints, then it's hard to see what would motivate. Like if all the evidence and all the conviction is in favor of P, and P rules out Q and R and S, it becomes hard to see why one should be motivated to consider Q, R, and S. However, if P is not inconsistent with, if it doesn't logically rule out these other views, then absolutely. Furthermore, I'll say this. There's a difference between my evidence ruling out certain or being perfect and my thinking that my evidence is perfect. So I might even imagine a scenario where, look, I don't see any way in which this could be wrong. It's got to be right. You might still be able to make a move where you say, yeah, but I've thought that before, and it's turned out that I've been wrong. And so I might be wrong in this case. So there's sort of a distinction there between first order evidence and second order evidence. My first order evidence completely supports a given belief, but I have some second order evidence for thinking that belief might be mistaken. Again, that would open the door to an open-minded consideration of other views. So I think I want to agree with the statement, provided that we understand the details in either of those two ways that I just mentioned.
Great, thank you. I think if there are any other questions that come in quickly, but I don't see any in the chat. Otherwise, everyone can join me in thanking. Oh, wait, there is one in the question bar. Oh, okay, this might be a nice one to summarize and kind of finish things up. So is open-mindedness the willingness to listen to other points of view or the willingness to change at the onset? And what is that difference there?
Oh, good. Interesting. It is at least the willingness to listen to other points of view. But again, I think you could have someone who is willing to listen to other points of view, but who is always resistant to changing their minds, even when upon listening to a different point of view, they found out that the evidence really favors that other point of view. I'd say that person is not open-minded. But the way that question was put is very interesting. The alternative was, is it just this, or does it require changing the belief at the onset or outset? I don't think it requires that either. And this is what, if we talked about religious faith and open-mindedness, like one of the points I was going to draw our attention to is that you might think that, like, I mean, this could apply to faith in people. It could apply to strong convictions. It doesn't have to apply to religious faith, but you could think like having faith in God or another person requires a kind of trust. And it seems weird to suggest, if in fact I'm suggesting this, it could seem weird to suggest that you can really trust someone and then change your mind as soon as you encounter some counter evidence about the existence or trustworthiness of that person. Like, trust is sort of abiding even when things aren't that clear, or even when the appearances might pull you in a different direction. I think all of that is compatible with with open-mindedness as I wanted to describe it. And that's because of this sort of very easily missable caveat in my initial description of open-mindedness, where I said that open-mindedness can require changing our minds if, on the whole, one's evidence supports doing so. And certainly there are scenarios, like we have, just think about this in the context of friendship or relationship, right? We trust another person, but that doesn't mean that we never come into evidence that might make us wonder, what, like, really, that person said that, or that person allowed this? That doesn't fit with what I know of that person. Well, a scenario like that is not one in which your evidence on the whole favors rejecting your faith in that person. So you can have some counter evidence for a belief without your evidence as a whole aligning with that counter evidence. And so, I think, so I wouldn't want to say, in other words, to get back to the question, I wouldn't want to say that it requires changing your mind at the outset or the onset or at the first appearance of counter evidence or at the first appearance of something plausible about another way of thinking about things. I don't think it requires that, but it requires more than just a willingness to listen, because you can be willing to listen, but listen poorly or never change your mind. And I would say that would make one less than open-minded.
Great. Well, thank you. I think a lot of us will be leaving here trying to be more open-minded. And so
good luck.
Yes, right. It's easier said than done, but I think we have a framework to work on it in our own lives and with others. So please join me in thanking Professor Bear for joining us today. And Sarla had already put in the chat several ways to stay engaged with these issues and with IIIT's work on these. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, whichever time zone you're in and wherever in the world we reach you. So thank you.
Thanks everybody for